Well, the phrase heart language has taken on the aura of a technical term within the Bible translation movement. However, it has never been a technical term among scholars. And I believe that the typical way it's being used as a synonym for mother tongue is keeping the movement from a proper understanding of how languages function in a multilingual world. In this paper, I trace the origins of the term and then discuss two ways in which I believe that using it as a technical term is doing harm to the movement. My search began with a statement in the mainstream academic literature in a paper published in the journal Language as part of a collection on the topic of SIL International and the disciplinary culture of linguistics. Linguistic anthropologist Courtney Handman writes, SIL and other translation organizations' materials specifically focus on the mother tongue, or heart language, as it was once called, and then she refers to Cowan's book. A speaker's first native language holds a special place in Christian translation literature as the language in which the scripture and other materials can best be understood by receptor communities. Her characterization of SIL as focusing on mother tongue is accurate, and so is her citation of George Cowan's book, The Word That Kindles, as an authoritative source for the underlying ideology. However, one part of the statement is not true. It implies that Cowan used the term heart language and that it has now fallen out of vogue. But in fact, when I examined Cowan's book, I found that the exact opposite is the case. Cowan did not use the term. Rather, as we will see, it has now come into vogue since his book was written. Cowan's book contains a section on terminology within the chapter named Which Language? He defines his term of choice in this way. By mother tongue, we mean the language spoken from infancy. This language is the first and perhaps the only one spoken. It seems natural to a person and is adequate to talk about all of life's situations. Neither the term heart language nor even the word heart appears in that chapter. Ken Pike addressed the same question in an essay called, We Will Tell Them, but in What Language? He never speaks of mother tongue, but uses the term local language in the opening paragraph, perhaps a sign of being attuned to the terminology more likely to be used in academic circles. He does, however, appeal to the metaphor of the language of one's birth in an allusion to Acts 2:8. I have been unable to find any evidence that Pike ever spoke of heart language. There is a passage in which he uses language of the heart, however, but with a completely different meaning. He concludes the title essay for the picture book that Wycliffe published in 1972 for promoting the work of SIL, the book Language and Faith, with these words, Let's see if you and we can serve our neighbor, giving to him the documents which have let us become one community, citizens of heaven, talking the common language of the heart. Here he is using the phrase to refer not to any particular human language, but to a transcendent capacity to communicate across languages. Pushing the timeline back even further to the founder, I was able to use Cal Hibbard's compilation of selected excerpts from talks and letters as a searchable text corpus. The word heart occurs 92 times in that collection, but never in association with language. The term mother tongue occurs only 3 times, so neither was that the founder's preferred term. The most common modifier of language in the corpus are Indian, their, every, and own language is the most frequent with 32 occurrences. One might surmise that bilingualism was so rare in his early experience that he did not find it necessary to develop terms for distinguishing languages by function. The mental model was that everybody just had their own language. If the terminology of heart language did not come from the early leaders of the movement, then where did it come from? I began that search by asking SIL's corporation secretary to find when the term first surfaced in the official records of the organization. The earliest occurrence he found was just in 1997. That's like 21 years ago. In a letter written by a board member, the longer phrase, language of the heart, was adopted by the board as the label for a core value in 2001. Another significant milestone in the history of the term came in 2001 in an informational report to the board about the work of Seed Company. This reported that their organizational mission statement is to translate the scriptures into the heart language of people groups still without God's word. To search for when heart language first started being used in the SIL literature, I used LinguaLink's library, a collection of the many notes on series, plus about 60 books. The earliest occurrence in that corpus is in a Notes on Literacy piece by Peggy Wendell in 1975. The next occurrence came 5 years later. The graph on the screen shows the number of occurrences in each 5-year period. It climbs to a rate of what amounts to 4 occurrences per year in the early 90s, but then you see it drops off again. Could we push the search for the first occurrence back even further? For help with this, I turned to SIL's corporate historian, Boone Aldridge, who examined an archive of all the issues of translation, the promotional magazine that Wycliffe began publishing in 1943. He found a progression of passages beginning in 1956, which speaks of the heart when describing the spiritual impact of Bible translation. And these are all reproduced in the proceedings, beginning on page 98. This leads up to the earliest use that we've found so far of heart language in the Wycliffe and SIL literature. It occurs in 1968 in an article by a Wycliffe staff writer that introduces the newly formed Wycliffe Associates. In that article, she explains that Wycliffe's primary purpose is to preach the gospel not where Christ was named, through the translated word into the heart language of the primitive peoples, the tongue wherein they were born. These investigations thus found that the term heart language appears to have been coined by a Wycliffe staff writer when announcing the birth of Wycliffe Associates, and to have come to maturity when it was incorporated in the official mission statement of Seed Company. These 3 organizations have something in common, namely that their primary function has been to promote Bible translation among Christians in the United States and to raise resources for the cause. That led me to hypothesize that the rise of heart language as a term is due to its effectiveness in communicating the need for Bible translation to that constituency. This hypothesis could be tested by looking into the extent to which the term is used by different kinds of organizations. The site search and exact search features of Google make it possible to do this. The chart that's on the screen now shows a compilation or a comparison of the usage of mother tongue versus heart language on the websites of the 4 organizations that I've mentioned so far. They are ordered by number of occurrences of heart language. Note that while both terms are used on all 4 websites, mother tongue is used overwhelmingly more often on the SIL website, whereas the opposite is true on the Wycliffe Associates site. The English Wikipedia offers a baseline for comparing terminology. It reflects a consensus of what are widely considered to be proper technical terms. A search of Wikipedia reveals that heart language occurs in only 3 pages. By contrast, mother tongue occurs in over 5,000 pages. The alternative term native language occurs on nearly 5,000 pages. But both of these are described as having problems, so the consensus of Wikipedia editors is that first language, which also occurs in over 5,000 pages, is the preferred term. Thus, the 2 former terms are redirected to first language. That term, with its abbreviation L1, is also the preferred term in Ethnologue. Another technical term that is favored for some academic purposes is local language. It occurs on over 2,000 pages of the Wikipedia. It is also the term that Lewis and Simons chose to use in sustaining language use. A website selects its terminology to fit the target audience. The graph on the screen, which you can find in your proceedings on page 102, if you can't read the fine print from the back, provides an analysis of terminology on the websites of 22 organizations that are related to the Bible translation movement, with the Wikipedia and UNESCO included for comparison. The green bars represent the use of first language and local language, which are grouped into a single category as representing preferred technical terms. The blue bars represent the use of mother tongue as a popular term for a general audience, and the yellow bars represent the use of heart language as a more emotive term for a religious audience. The lengths of the bars represent the relative proportions of the use of these terms on these sites as shown by the searching on Google. The top group of 3 websites are those in which the technical terms predominate. The second group of 14 are those in which the popular terminology, or the blue bar, predominates. And then the final group of 7 are those in which the religious terminology of heart language predominates. Perhaps the most surprising result in this chart is that the Wycliffe Global Alliance appears in the top group as having predominantly technical terminology. A possible factor here is that the terms preferred for a technical audience are also more modern. Mother tongue is now somewhat dated. The Wycliffe Global Alliance is only 10 years old and thus was able to use modern terminology when it began developing its website. But another factor is that they have a truly global audience. While metaphors of the heart as the seat of emotions abound across Romance and Germanic languages, they are far from universal. Thus, the Alliance avoids using heart language since it fails to resonate with many Asians, Africans, and Pacific Islanders. Having explored the history of the term heart language and the extent of its use, we now turn to a discussion of problems inherent in using the term. Particularly in focus are problems with trying to use heart language as a technical term while writing about language. While the term heart language may have the positive result of moving a particular kind of audience to action, the way the term is being used is also having the negative result of perpetuating a conceptual bias that idealizes the world in monolingual terms. We have shown that Townsend simply spoke of their own language. No further description was needed when a people did not use any other languages. As recognition grew that multiple languages were typically relevant in the life of a people, mother tongue emerged as the term favored in the SIL literature to distinguish their own language from other languages. It was typically the language of deep and intimate in-group communication, and thus was appropriate for Bible translation. There was a one-to-one correspondence, so it worked to substitute the mother tongue in place of their own language in updating the literature from the founding era. However, in the process of rebranding mother tongue as heart language in recent decades, things seriously break down if we continue this pattern and simply substitute the new term in statements that previously used the former term. This is because mother tongue evokes the manner in which the language was acquired, but heart language is about how the language functions in daily life. There is often a one-to-one correspondence between the two, but this is by no means a given. For instance, an oft-repeated definition is, your heart language is the language you dream in. The wording of that definition presumes that a person has only one such language. But what if you can dream in 2 languages, as fluent bilinguals report doing? Another kind of breakdown occurs in the statement, translating the Bible into the heart language of a people group. Again, the definite article encodes the presupposition of a single language, but it also implies another inherent assumption, namely that the one language is the traditional local language. But in a situation where a people group has undergone significant shift toward an outside language, the traditional language may no longer be understood well enough to speak to the heart. This can even be the case for someone who learned the traditional language as a mother tongue, but began the shift to the other languages at an early age. So this explains the title of the paper we're going to hear later this morning from Daniel Paul, which is, "When None of My Heart Languages is My Mother Tongue." The rhetoric of heart language, at least when indiscriminately used as a substitute for mother tongue, serves to perpetuate a conceptual bias that idealizes a situation in which people have just one language that matters for Bible translation. If the term is to be used at all, it should be the label for a way that a language functions in life and not as a synonym for mother tongue or first language. So what function is it? Seeking the answer to that question should drive us into the academic literature to see what experts are saying about the functions of language. A second negative result of using the term heart language is that it serves to isolate the Bible translation movement from the wider academic discourse about the functions of language in a multilingual world. While such isolation might be expected for the promotional literature of the movement, it poses a serious problem if the term is also used in scholarship by the movement. Terminological isolation has two undesirable consequences. The wider academic world will not be able to benefit from our scholarship, nor will the ears of the Bible translation community be attuned to learn from the wider community. In his contribution to a symposium on the topic of what is Christian scholarship, Nicholas Wolterstorff, a leading Christian philosopher and professor emeritus at Yale University, concludes with this summary statement. It is the calling of the Christian scholar to think and act with a Christian mind and to speak with an appropriate Christian voice as she engages in her discipline. He states that a key aspect of speaking with an appropriate Christian voice is that it, quote, be a voice that can genuinely be heard by one's fellow scholars in the discipline, a voice such that it contributes to the dialogue of the discipline, end quote. It is necessary for the Christian scholar to know the vocabulary and the ways of thinking and speaking of the mainstream discipline. Otherwise, she cannot speak into the discipline in a way that it can be heard and accepted. To scholars in the mainstream, talk of heart language is likely to sound amusing or quaint at best, or because of the religious overtones, to be seriously off-putting at worst. But the concept behind heart language encompasses far more than religion. It is wonderfully holistic, as the appendix to the paper in the proceedings by John Waters so eloquently presents. Is there a label for that concept that would allow the Bible translation community to speak more effectively into the wider scholarly dialogue about these issues? Water proposes a possibility: acquired reflex language. The flip side of speaking is listening. In order to listen for how the wider academic literature could inform understanding of the holistic concept that lies behind heart language, it is necessary to know the vocabulary of the discipline and to recognize when relevant things are being said. To what extent is heart language the same as the language of intimate insider communication, what sociolinguists simply call the language of the home domain, or as it is sometimes more poetically rendered, the language of hearth and home? To what extent is heart language a matter of deep comprehension versus deep emotional impact versus deep self-identification? The papers to follow by Kyle Harris and Daniel Paul are good examples of delving into the academic literature to learn how it might inform our understanding on these issues. So to bring this to a conclusion, the phrase heart language has taken on the aura of a technical term within the Bible translation movement, but it appears to be a term that has developed primarily as a way to promote the cause to a religious audience. It is not defined well enough nor accepted broadly enough to be used as a technical term in scholarship. Rather than doing so and creating a literature that is isolated from the academic mainstream, scholars in the Bible translation community are encouraged to use terminology that aligns with the broader academic literature as they articulate the essential concepts that underlie the notion. In so doing, we will be better able to contribute to and learn from the wider scholarly dialogue about the functions of language in our multilingual world. Thank you.